Coverage with Chris Graham.
Welcome to the podcast. Chris Graham and Rod Mullins, and we're going to talk NASCAR here on our podcast today. And Rod, we got to start. Usually what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, but we're going to talk about the Vegas race this past weekend. We're going to bring it back. So break down what happened and who got the leg up on the playoffs here in NASCAR in 2019.
Well, who got the leg up was Martin Truex Jr. After being kind of quiet there for a while, Martin Truex Jr. has now just come to life with a big win in that race there at Las Vegas. And really, the way I look at it is right now who's falling apart is Kyle Busch. Because Kyle Busch is, that was just one kind of performance you do not want to take with Vegas, and especially Vegas being his hometown. And he has done so well at Vegas in the past, and he gets there and runs up behind Garrett Smithley in a car that he's competing in that weekend. One of his many races he competes in on the Monster Cup Series. He's tried to just get a leg up out of being in the extended series. He runs up behind him, and then Kyle Busch just makes this, to me, it's like an excuse. He makes this excuse up that he thought that the other driver was going to go high. He wasn't paying it. He just came up on him, and then the last thing that happens, he runs into the back of him and ends up finishing back in the top 20, really in the second 10 out of that, and he doesn't finish well at all in that race. And he was talking to some of the reporters after the race, and he told them, because, you know, I had some insurance. He said, now I'm going to pay out some of these premiums, and I'm going to be out. And so he's kind of knocked out of it right now, and he's not out from the top spot. And Martin Truex, he's in now for the second round of the playoffs, and things look good for him. And he proved that, by racing and doing well, he was able to gain some position. And, again, Kyle Busch just, he's unhappy about things because he turned around. He's not been happy with the NASCAR aero setup for most of the season, even though it's won him some races. But now we're coming down to the crunch time, and those races that he needs to win, he's kind of putting the excuse off on another thing of, either it was another driver, it was an Xfinity driver, or it's the aero setup. Let's just take and put blame where blame is due. Let's accept the fact that Rowdy just messed up on Sunday, and he's just a little bit embarrassed about the whole thing in front of the home crowd.
And he's exacerbating it. He's talking more about that race. He's not letting it go. But does he have a point to some degree? He came back from 2 laps down. He got himself in position for a pretty good finish, maybe a top 5 finish even. And then he runs in the back of a car that was 12 laps back late in the race, and it knocks Busch back into 19th. I know there's a story about how this sort of just highlights the disparities between the different types of teams, the well-funded teams and not so well-funded teams. I think there's a discussion point there, and I also wonder, Rod, if there's not something kind of odd. I mean, we have 16 drivers in the playoffs, and it's not like in the NFL if a team makes the playoffs, they have to worry about a team that didn't make the playoffs knocking them out of the playoffs. But in this kind of case, that kind of is what happened here. Is there something does NASCAR need to kind of look at its playoffs in the future and maybe, narrow the fields a bit? I don't know. There's a lot to kind of unpack from this, I guess.
Yeah, there is a lot to kind of unpack out of this whole thing, and to kind of look at when he makes the remark in regard to Garrett Smithley, and he talks about him, and he's the one that he ran into there toward the latter stages of the race. He's talking about these teams being better funded, the better funded teams, and then the lesser funded teams. Kyle Busch needs to be careful how he says some things, because here's a man that goes and drives on just about all the circuits. He drives on the Gander Mountain Outdoor Series. He drives the Truck Series is what he drives in. He drives in the Expensive Series. And of course, his home is in the Monster Cup Series. But you really don't go and make, jabs at some of these drivers, because sooner or later it can come back to bite you before it's over with. And we're tending to forget here, maybe in some ways, some of the fans might be tending to forget, who knocked Kyle Busch out of the potential of winning the race at Watkins Glen. It was Bubba Wallace. And Bubba just finally said, I'm tired of it. I'm tired of being pushed around by this guy who gets out there on the track and says, I'm going to run you down and I'm going to run you over. It doesn't make any difference. Bubba Wallace was not running laps down at that point. I think at that point in the race, he was not several laps down, but he was still trying to compete and at least participate in that race. Same thing you have to say with Garrett Smithley. He's getting experience while he's out there. Maybe it was the spotter's fault. Maybe it was the team's fault for telling him, you need to move out of the way and let things happen. But, you got to remember, there are people out there that have got things against Kyle Busch. And I know there's some people that may say that he is just this great, quote unquote, hell of a race car driver. But there's one thing about it. You go and you run your mouth too much, or you do things too much against some other situations, especially in the Xfinity Series and some of the others, and then you start to poke at NASCAR a little bit to see how far they're going to jump. Karma can bite you, and that's what's going to happen. And I think that's what happened this time with Kyle Busch. Karma came back, and it bit him, and it bit him real good in this case. And he needs to just right now, at this point, plain and simple, he needs to shut his mouth. He needs to go out there and prove what he can do on the racetrack and not blame Garrett Smithley for the situation. He was the one that came up on him. He should have been better prepared as a driver, and he should have been listening more to his father, more so than worrying about Garrett Smithley out there on the track. He could have done something about it, but I don't think Kyle Busch chose to do anything about it in that race.
We'll talk about the race at Richmond coming up later in the podcast. Let's give some off-the-track news. Silly season's already started, even though we're still several races ago. News about Richard Childress Racing. Give us the latest there, Rod.
Daniel Hemrick will be out of the Richard Childress Racing team at the end of the season, and that's going to make room for Xfinity regular season champion Tyler Reddick to make it in to race with that car for next season. That will be the number 8 car. And Daniel Hemrick has had an up and down season. He has raced pretty well, I think, for a rookie season, at least in the Cup Series, but it wasn't enough with the same situations we have to talk about, sponsors and different things like that. You've got a situation with him of where he was out there and he really turned a lot of heads while he'd been in the Xfinity Series, but he has turned enough heads in the Monster Cup Series, and so now he's going to be out of a job, and they're going to move in Tyler Reddick, who is still maintain some connection with the Xfinity Series, and of course has run for Richard Childress Racing. He'll be running next season probably in all likelihood, so we're going to see him changing things up. And of course, we talked last week about Paul Menard stepping down, and then Matt Benedetto going to be moving up with the Wood Brothers. We're still early on in this silly season situation. We know that there are some drivers that are poised to stay where they're at. Bubba Wallace is one of those drivers that's going to be staying where he is. There's just some question marks right now as to whether or not Tyler Reddick will be ready to go up to this series. He's going to be racing for a championship. There's going to be a lot of eyes on him in the Xfinity Series. I think he's ready for it. It's just a matter of that thing of the team funding, the performance, and how well that driver gets out there on Sunday afternoons or Saturday nights, depending on when the races are and how they perform.
Some big off-the-track news now, going from the racer and team level, the driver and team level, all the way up to the biggest level of off-the-track news. Speedway Motorsport, some business news this week that could have far-reaching impacts on NASCAR.
Yeah, it's one of those things of where Speedway Motorsport, which has been a Wall Street traded entity there for several years, has now gotten some of the, I guess in one situation, some of their debt has been taken care of, but they have merged in with another organization which could make it possible for International Speedway Corporation to quite possibly align themselves before it's over with Speedway Motorsport. And I don't think there'll be a takeover, but there will be some kind of perhaps gathering of the mind, so to speak, and a gathering of resources to see what they can do with maybe try to save NASCAR, at least some people's situation. They'll try to go and do what they can. But it's in the capable hands, I think, of Marcus Smith, which is Bruton Smith's son, and also Greg Walter, who is the executive vice president, at least he is for Charlotte Motor Speedway. And they are working together to try to put together an operation right now. I think that it's going to at least save NASCAR, so to speak, or at least provide a roadmap for the way the sport needs to go here for the future. And it might open the door for International Speedway Corporation to really walk in the door and say, let's see what we can do if we combine our resources together. So they're off the stock market now. They are a privately owned corporation. So we'll have to see how it goes going into next year.
More off the track news, and our last little tidbit here, and it's sad news. Tragic death of a NASCAR legend. What's the latest there, Rod?
Well, Mike Stefanik, 61 years old. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's ran a lot of these short tracks. He ran at, if I'm not mistaken, I think he even ran at the old Lonesome Pine Speedway down here in Coburn, close to where I live. But he also ran a lot of the short tracks in the Northeast. Just an exceptional driver when it came to the NASCAR Modified Series. He's killed in a plane crash on the really on the Connecticut and Rhode Island state line this past weekend, riding or flying in his plane. And it was very sad to hear the news about Mike Stefanik. He is just a guy that has gone out there and has been such a great driver for all these years. Went out there and just did his talking out on the track. And, it's kind of coincidental that we talk about that and we talk about Kyle Busch there at the beginning of the podcast. But he did a lot of his talking when he went out onto the track. And I think I saw him really mad one time when one of the pit reporters for Fox Sports got with him during a NASCAR Modified tour. And he had been wrecked, and he was very upset. He didn't have a lot of words to say. It was one of those times of where you just kind of back off and you don't say anything to the man. Enough is enough. But Mike Stefanik, it's going to be rough dealing with the fact that he's going to be gone because they've got an open wheel, a modified series race coming up at Martinsville here soon, and he used to race at one of those at that event coming up before the Cup Series race. So it's going to be sad, definitely not having Mike Stefanik in the pits and also out on the track in the NASCAR Modified Tour. Really, he kind of raced some, and he raced some at one point, maybe some Cup races, but he really stayed where he wanted to be at. That was in the Modified Series, that open wheel, and he loved to do that sort of thing, and he was dominant when he got out there on the track.
Richmond International Raceway in the capital city hosting a playoff race this weekend. What can we look for from this field, both especially at the playoff participant level? What can we look for this weekend in Richmond?
Well, Richmond, you never know really what to expect out of Richmond, and of course we're in the fall race now, as Richmond will be at night. I know they've had a race there during the daytime, but it always seems like when a night race takes place at Richmond, it harkens back to the days of old when a lot of these tracks and a lot of these drivers really cut their teeth on oval racing, so to speak. But now I will tell you this. Right now, the drivers that are looking good going into this next round of races and looking good going into Richmond, you really have to look at Kevin Harvick, Joey Logano, Kyle Busch. Yes, and I said Kyle Busch, Brad Keselowski, Chase Elliott, Denny Hamlin. They all appear to be in good shape. They're going to advance to the second round, I think. And even though this race will be at Richmond, there will be a lot of determination things that's going to be taking place at Richmond. Now, Martin Truex's last victory last weekend at Las Vegas put him into that second round, but he could still be a key factor coming up in this first round of races. He won at Richmond in the spring race for his first shortcut track victory. He was headed for the win in last year's race at the Roval, of course, and we're going to be covering that next week as we go down to Charlotte. But, of course, Jimmy Johnson and him got together there in the final chicane. But Mark Truex could very well dominate again with another great performance at Richmond. Things look good for him. I'm really looking at right now Ryan Newman trying to hold together here. He has 2,056 points. He's 29, or Hamlin right now, he's 29 points behind Denny Hamlin, is what I'm trying to say. And, we talked about Kyle Busch still being in good shape. fight, a very frustrating race, anger with these slower cars, but he's got those insurance points, those 45 playoff points, including that 15 for the regular season championship. You know, he's going to be okay, but I think Richmond will tell the tale for a lot of them coming up this weekend, and it's always a side-banging deal when they go to Richmond because it's short-track racing at its best. This is going to be the race that will be moving to Bristol next year when they move the night race to Bristol, and the playoff race will be racing in September next year. So, they're going to want to go out on at least a good term up at Richmond and this time around before they get ready to move on into the next series of races. Next week, that big race coming up at Charlotte with the Roval, that's going to be a huge race for some of these drivers coming back to Charlotte for the second return.
Yeah, I was going to mention that as we wrapped up the podcast. You're all squared away you'll be there on the scene for us in Charlotte for the Roval for the second straight year. That's right?
Yep, that's right. We'll be down there for the Saturday race that'll be taking place. That's going to be the drive for the Cure 250 that'll be taking place. I think 250 or 300 they're going to have down there. That's the Xfinity Series race, and then we'll be there on Sunday for the Roval race, the Bank of America Roval 400. And last year, we just had a great time. It seemed like it was a typical road race at first until the very end when Brad Keselowski, Kyle Larson, and them wrecked as they were going into the turn. They now call that heartburn turn right there as they all collapsed and went into the wall and then missed the turn. It was almost like they were still racing on an oval or a tri-oval, so to speak, and it cost Brad Keselowski a chance, Kyle Larson a chance, and then, of course, we mentioned about Mark Truex and Jimmy Johnson getting into it, and Johnson spinning Truex out there in the chicane. It's going to be a good race, and we're looking forward to it, bringing all the coverage back on AFC for next week.
Yeah, that one was fun. I remember. So that's something to look forward to. So when we have Rod back on next week, we'll break down Richmond. We'll look ahead to the Roval. A lot of fun coming up. Well, thanks, Rod, for your time.
Appreciate it, Chris. Thank you.